This morning I'm picking what is coming close to the end of the tomatoes. The crop has been really great this year. There's been heaps and heaps of tomatoes. The Marmantis have done quite well, some nice big ones there, but the Romas have probably done the best, and there's just piles and piles of Romas. Essentially, there is too many tomatoes this year, more than I really like to have to deal with. While the vines are now dying from some late blight, the fruit is still fine and can still keep picking. You'll notice this plant though is still doing okay. The soil here has been a little bit better, and this is the Roma, and they're a little bit more resistant, particularly when they've had sufficient water, and I think this area has done better on water. Why have I got too many tomatoes? And I think other people are in this same situation of having too many tomatoes. Our tendency is to overplant. We compensate for potential losses and plant more than we really need. Now, when I first started growing tomatoes, which was quite a few years ago here in Tasmania, I did have some quite high losses, basically because I didn't trellis at all. I just let them go on the ground, and we had some wetter years, and look, probably 50% of the crop was a loss in insect attack and grubs getting into them and so on. With more careful watering, trellising, making sure it's tied up, though I have failed a bit on this one, and the weather being kind to me. This year the weather in the ripening period has been quite dry, and that means that I have almost no loss with this crop. There's been very, very few that I've had to throw away. Most of them have been perfect, beautiful tomatoes like this with no blemishes at all. And that means that the 20 plants that I have is really too many. So what should I do? Well, probably the first thing is a note to myself: don't plant so many tomatoes next year. While a few years ago I was planting 30 plants and losing a lot, now I've refined my growing techniques, and it means still with 20 I have too many tomatoes. So I really need to drop back probably to 15 or maybe even 12 plants may even produce sufficient, particularly considering the quantity that these Romas produce. Now, I grow the Romas primarily as a processing tomato, and I produce routinely a couple of products from them, and we'll go inside and I'll show you that in a moment. But what can you do with tomatoes? Well, you can freeze them, you can dry them, you can make sauces and relishes, and you can bottle them using the Vicola method or similar methods. And of course, one of the major traditional products is to make passata. Now, to make passata you really need a passata machine. If you're doing any quantity, you can do a little bit with a muhly by hand, but in the fact that true passata you're actually separating the seeds and the skins, a machine is really ideal. Now, I don't have a passata machine, and that really affects the choices that I make in terms of products. The products that I make, because I'm probably a little bit lazy, but maybe it's just the fact that I'm really busy with other things, I don't really bother getting rid of the skins or the seeds, and don't really find that the product is in any way worse for that. Now, one of the things I would like to do is dry them, and that's a really great option for many people. But we have solar power, and that means that electrical drying methods are really out of the question. It's not a time of the year where we're lighting wood fires, and so we can't really dry on the wood fire like we do with apples over winter. Sun drying would be the only option at the moment, but the weather is already, at the beginning of autumn, becoming a little bit intermittent. Yesterday was quite cloudy, and after today the next 2 or 3 days are predicted to be a little bit cloudy and potential rain. So it's not an ideal time for me to slice these up and put them out to dry in the sun. Freezing isn't really an option for us because of the solar powered factor, and in a moment I'll take you inside and really show you why we don't freeze. But before we do, I've got to finish this picking, and then we'll go inside and have a look at what's going on in there. So that's the last of the Mum Andes, I think, here, or maybe one or two more, but they've been really nice and a great solid tomato. The Romas are doing really well. There will be a few more, but the quantity that will come now will be fairly small and we'll be able to consume those fresh, because Romas keep really quite well and you have a bit of time to use them. But when you've got this sort of quantity, at once you do need to process them in some way. Also, the fact that I already have this much or more inside. Okay, let's go inside and I'll show you our freezer and show you the reason why we don't freeze in any significant quantity. Okay, here's our freezer, and as you can see, it's really quite small. What's in it? Well, principally some sweet corn that was the end of the season crop when it's ripening too fast for you to consume, and some bulk beans that were excess to fresh use. All those things will be used within a few months, but there's really no space for much else. The simple reality of solar power is that you need to size your consumption and your system to match the lowest level of production. Refrigeration and freezing is the major ongoing power consumer in that it needs power continuously, and you really can't just turn it off on demand to match your supply. So that means that it's not really a practical situation to use freezing when you're on solar power, unless you're willing to spend a considerable amount of money on solar panels and batteries particularly to actually support you across winter. Also, I'm not a big fan of freezing because it is a mechanical storage method and you're dependent on machines actually continuing to run, that the motors continue to function. And if it fails, that is your food supply at risk. Of course, the vulnerability of frozen food is even greater when you're on a grid power supply, because you're then totally at the mercy of the grid, and if the grid goes down for whatever reason, even for relatively short periods, you're going to lose your food unless you've got a backup power supply in place. So it's not my favourite method of food storage at all. I'd much prefer to dry or to put into a closed bottle system like this, which is going to keep without any further support. So these are the products that we have produced in the past, and this first one is a tomato sauce, and I have a video on making this. It's a sugar-free tomato sauce. We consume probably a fair quantity of this. I make probably around about 30 of these bottles a year, and we probably consume most of those in the year. The second product is a relish or chutney, depending on what you like to call it. It's a very similar recipe to the sauce. It has some sultanas and a couple of extra spices in it. It's chunky rather than smooth, and we make a couple of dozen of these, and that lasts us generally around a year. The third product that I have made is simply a Vacola bottled tomato that is a little bit concentrated. I've taken the excess water off it and concentrated it so that it is thicker than if you just did the tomato without any further processing. If it was the whole tomato, probably half of this would be a clear liquid or water from the tomato, not excess water, just water from the tomato. But I've drained that off before I've bottled it, and that means that I have a lot more tomato solids in there. Tomato, surprisingly, actually has more water than a watermelon does. You wouldn't expect it, but that's the way it is. So when you're processing tomato, you're processing a lot of water. But we really haven't utilised a lot of this. My wife says that it's a little bit too runny still for what she wants to do in the kitchen. We're mostly utilising things in curries or soups, and this hasn't been her ideal product. So we still have this left over from last year. So this year I really want to do something a little bit different and try and match it to consumption. And I think that's one of the important things when you're considering how to process your tomatoes to store them, think about what you use. Think about what you buy in tomato products through the year, if you buy tomato products, and how you like to use your tomatoes. Are you using it in a pasta sauce? Are you using it in salads as dried tomatoes? Or using tomato sauce, relishes? Think about those things and try and match your production to match your consumption. That way you'll use it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get now the tomatoes that I picked a few days ago, because when I pick them I like to let them sit for a few days. I'm going to wash them up and put them in a pot. Then I'm going to part cook them, and the purpose of this is to actually get the moisture out. I will lightly salt them at this stage, and that way it will help the water extraction. The liquid that I then pour off this will be not wasted. We will drink this as a light tomato juice. It's not in any way like tomato juice that you would normally buy from a shop. It is much thinner and lighter flavour, but this way you're actually concentrating your tomato solids and reducing the amount of water that you're actually putting in bottles. Now that the excess water has come off it and I've mostly got the solids, because this is what I've previously just put in Vicola bottles, and my wife still says it is too runny for what she likes, too much water coming through. What I'm going to try and do is imitate what you would achieve with a passata, if I had a passata machine, which I don't. I'm going to use the stick mixer in this to actually puree it, and then I'm going to add a small amount of guar gum to it to thicken it. I like using guar gum because it thickens without any extra heat. It simply reacts to the water that is in a product and thickens it, and you need very little of it because it is a very powerful thickening agent. This I'm just going to put into the Vicola bottles, which I've prepared, and I'm going to process this the same way as I would any other fruit to sterilize it in the Vicola bottles and seal it. So this is the end result. Now there is a little bit of liquid showing on the bottom, the water that has dropped out, but time will really be the test on this as to whether this is an acceptable product in the kitchen. Look, it's probably best to look at excess tomatoes as a blessing rather than a curse. I know it takes time to deal with them, but if you can put them into a product that you're going to use, whatever that is for you, it's going to be really good in the end.